Behold her now, Elara Mackinnon, framed in the vast vaulted great hall of Glenrevy Castle, where torchlight and chandelier gleam dance across the ancient stone. Her chestnut hair falls unbound in soft waves, catching fire from the flames below. Her simple gown of deep green wool, humble yet defiant, stands in quiet rebellion against the crimson tartans and gilded grandeur that surround her. Tears glisten upon cheeks flushed with wonder and trembling joy, as the man she once knew only as a storm-tossed wanderer sinks to one knee before her, his strong hand outstretched, an heirloom ring of silver and sapphire burning like captured starlight in his palm. "Marry me, Elara," declares Callum Fraser, Laird of Glenrevy, his voice a low thunder that fills the breathless hall. "For in offering a weary traveller broth by your humble hearth, you have kindled a fire in a heart long frozen by Highland solitude. If this moment, this shattering of worlds, this triumph of unspoken love over every iron law of station and silence, has seized your breath and quickened your pulse, then subscribe now, for what follows shall unravel destinies forever and reveal how the simplest mercy can remake an empire of the soul." In that suspended instant, the scent of beeswax and heather hangs heavy in the air, the assembled household frozen in awe, while Elara beholds at last the full truth. The shadowed stranger who sought refuge from the gale in her lonely croft is none other than the reclusive laird himself, who walked his lands in disguise to touch the unadorned hearts of his people. Yet this pinnacle of revelation was forged in far quieter embers, in stolen evenings beside a modest peat fire, where whispered confessions and lingering glances wove a bond neither duty nor distance could sever. The wind came down from the cairngorms that night like a living thing, wild and grieving, clawing at the heather and screaming across the glen until every shutter in the village of Strathmore rattled in its frame. Snow hissed against the stone walls of Elara Mackinnon's croft, seeking entry through every crack, while inside the single room the peat fire burned low and stubborn, casting a trembling amber glow over the simple furnishings she had tended alone these 5 years. Elara stood at the small, frost-laced window, her reflection faint in the glass, a woman of 28, slender and straight-backed, with eyes the colour of rain-soaked slate and hair the deep russet of autumn bracken. Her gown of deep green wool, oft mended but clean, clung to her frame as she pressed one palm to the cold pane, watching the world beyond dissolve into white fury. Widow's weeds had long been set aside, yet solitude had settled upon her like a familiar cloak. She wore it without complaint, for complaint changed nothing. The croft sat at the edge of Strathmore, where the track climbed toward the high passes and few travellers ventured in winter. Her late husband, Ian, had chosen the place for its quiet, and after the fever took him she had remained, tending the few sheep, the patch of kale, the herbs that dried in bunches from the rafters. The village tolerated her independence with the wary respect Highland folk reserve for those who ask little and give much in return. She was neither pitied nor courted. She was simply Elara, who would share her last oatcake with a stranger and ask no payment save decency. On this night the storm's voice rose to a shriek that drowned even the crackle of the fire. She had banked the peats carefully, knowing fuel must last until spring, and had just turned to ladle a little barley broth from the pot when a sound, different from the wind, reached her ears. A heavy, deliberate thud against the door, as though someone had staggered against it and lacked strength to knock again. Elara froze, spoon in hand. Travellers did not come this way in such weather. Bandits would not linger to knock. She set the spoon down silently, took the iron poker from the hearth, and moved to the door. The wind battered it as she drew the bolt. When she pulled it inward a fraction, the gale burst through like an angry guest, snuffing the candle upon the table and sending sparks whirling up the chimney. A man fell across the threshold. He collapsed to his knees in the rush of snow, one gloved hand clutching the door-frame for support. His cloak, dark and sodden, was crusted with ice. Beneath the hood his face was half hidden, but she saw exhaustion carved deep in the lines around his mouth and the pallor beneath several days' growth of beard. Broad-shouldered, tall even when brought low, He seemed less a man than a shadow the storm had torn from the mountain and flung at her feet. "Mercy," he rasped, the word barely audible over the howl outside. "Shelter, only for the night." Ilara did not hesitate. Highland hospitality was older than fear, and something in the stranger's voice, refined beneath the hoarseness, touched a chord of instinct deeper than caution. She set the poker aside, slipped an arm beneath his, and drew him fully inside with a strength born of years wrestling sheep and peat baskets. The door thudded shut against the storm's protest. She slid the bolt home and turned to him. He swayed where he stood, water pooling from his cloak onto her flagstones. Without a word she guided him to the settle beside the fire, pressed him down, and knelt to unfasten the frozen clasp at his throat. The cloak fell away to reveal a coat of good wool, damp but well cut, and boots that had once been fine. Not a tinker, then, nor a drover. Yet no laird would wander the high passes alone in winter. "Stay," she said quietly, as though gentling a wounded stag. "The fire will have you warm soon enough." He lifted his head then, and for the first time she met his eyes, storm-grey, sharp with intelligence, and haunted by a weariness no mere night's cold could account for. Something flickered there, surprise, perhaps, at the steadiness of her gaze, or gratitude too deep for easy words. "I would not impose," he murmured, the educated cadence unmistakable now. "You impose less than the wind," Ilara replied, rising to fetch the broth. "And I have broth enough for two." She ladled the steaming liquid into a wooden bowl, added a heel of oat bread, and placed it in his chilled hands. He wrapped his fingers around it as though the warmth itself were a miracle, and for a long moment simply stared into the fire. Outside, the gale raged on, but within the croft a fragile stillness settled, an unspoken covenant between two souls briefly thrown together by the mercy of fate. Ilara resumed her seat on the low stool opposite, hands folded in her lap, and watched the flames restore color to his face. She asked no questions. The Highlands taught patience as surely as they taught endurance. Whatever story he carried would be offered or withheld in its own time. Yet even as silence wrapped them like a shared plaid, she felt the night shift imperceptibly. Something irrevocable had entered with the stranger, something that smelled of snow and distant pine, of secrets and unspoken need, and the quiet croft, for all its familiar walls, would never feel entirely the same again. The door was barred once more against the night's fury, yet the croft still trembled with the storm's lingering wrath. Snow sifted through invisible crevices, settling in pale dust upon the flagstones, while the peat fire hissed in protest each time a gust found its way down the lum. Ilara moved with quiet purpose, heedless of the cold that clung to her skirts. She fetched a dry woolen blanket from the kist at the foot of her box-bed, shook it out, and draped it about the stranger's broad shoulders without ceremony. He sat upon the settle like a man unaccustomed to receiving aid, spine straight despite evident exhaustion, hands cradling the bowl of barley broth as though it were something fragile and infinitely precious. Steam rose in delicate curls, softening the hard edges of his face and revealing features that, even in weariness, carried the stamp of authority. High cheekbones, a resolute jaw shadowed by dark stubble, and a mouth shaped for command yet now held in careful restraint. His hair, black as a raven's wing, lay damp against his brow. Melted snow traced slow paths down his temples. Ilara resumed her place on the low three-legged stool opposite him, close enough to tend the fire, far enough to grant the illusion of solitude. She took up her mending, a stocking worn thin at the heel, and let the needle flash in the firelight, more to occupy her hands than from true necessity. Silence stretched between them, not awkward but strangely companionable, broken only by the wind's lament and the soft pop of burning peat. At length he spoke, voice low and roughened by cold. "You risk much, mistress, opening your door to an unknown man on such a night." "I risk more by leaving a soul to freeze," she answered without lifting her eyes from her work. "The good book bids us entertain strangers, for some have thereby welcomed angels unawares." A faint huff, half amusement, half something sadder, escaped him. "I assure you I am no angel, nor are most who knock in storms," she replied evenly. "Yet warmth is warmth, and broth is broth, whatever the bearer's wings or lack thereof." He studied her then, openly, as though trying to read the script of her soul in the calm lines of her profile. The firelight painted gold across her cheekbones and kindled copper sparks in the loose strands of chestnut hair that had escaped her simple knot. Her expression remained composed, yet there was nothing servile in it, only a quiet steadiness born of long acquaintance with hardship. He lifted the spoon at last and tasted the broth. Simple fare, barley, onion, a little salt meat, wild thyme gathered in summer, but his eyes closed briefly as though savoring something rare. When he opened them again, a flicker of wonder lingered there. "This is remarkable kindness," he said softly. "It is only supper," Elara countered, though a faint warmth touched her own cheeks at the intensity of his gratitude. "Nay," he insisted, voice dropping to a timbre that seemed to resonate in the very rafters. "In my experience, simple supper offered to a stranger without expectation of return is the rarest delicacy of all." She met his gaze then, needle paused mid-stitch. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgment of mutual isolation, perhaps, or the recognition of fellow travelers on lonely roads. Whatever it was, it settled in the small space like another presence, gentle yet undeniable. Outside, the gale redoubled its assault, rattling the latch as though demanding re-entry. Elara rose to bank the fire higher, adding 2 precious peats from the basket. Sparks swirled upward in a brief constellation before vanishing into darkness. "You will take the settle tonight," she said, practical as ever. "It is near the hearth and will keep the chill from your bones. I have blankets enough. I cannot displace you from your own bed." "You will not," she interrupted firmly. "The bed is mine, and I shall sleep sound in it, knowing no guest of this house freezes while I have fire to spare." He inclined his head in grave acceptance, the gesture oddly formal amid the humble surroundings. "Then I am in your debt, mistress?" "Mackinnon," she supplied. "Elara Mackinnon. And you need not name yourself unless you wish it. Many who pass this way prefer silence on such matters." A shadow crossed his features, regret, perhaps, or the weight of secrets. "Silence suits me well enough for now," he murmured, "though I would not have you think me ungrateful for your trust." "Trust is given, not owed," she replied, returning to her stool. "And tonight the storm trusts us both to endure it." He drank the rest of the broth slowly, breaking the oat bread and dipping it with deliberate care, as though prolonging the moment. When the bowl was empty he set it aside and leaned back against the settle, the blanket drawn close. The fire's glow traced the strong lines of his hands, hands that bore faint calluses yet also the evidence of finer habits, clean nails, a signet ring glinting dully beneath grime on his right forefinger before he subtly turned it inward. Elara resumed her mending, but her attention drifted often to her guest. There was a stillness about him now, a watchful quiet that spoke of thoughts turning inward. At times his gaze fixed upon the flames as though seeking answers in their restless dance. At others it returned to her, lingering with a curiosity he made no effort to disguise. "Tell me," he said at last, voice softer than the wind's moan, "do you often sit alone through such nights?" "Often enough," she admitted. "The glen is quiet in winter. Folk keep to their own hearths. And you do not find the silence burdensome?" She considered this, threading her needle anew. "Silence has its own voices, if one learns to listen. The fire speaks. The wind tells tales of the high Cories. And memory. She paused, then continued steadily. Memory keeps its own company. He nodded slowly, as though her words struck a chord deep within. Memory can be both companion and tormentor. Aye, she agreed. But tonight there is firelight and living breath to share the room. That drives the sharper ghosts back a little. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first she had seen, and it transformed his severity into something almost approachable. Then I am grateful to serve as ghost ward. The hours slipped by unmarked. Ilara banked the fire once more, set a candle in a clay holder upon the table should he need light in the night, and prepared for bed with the unself-conscious grace of one long alone. She drew the curtain that separated her box bed from the main room, yet left a gap sufficient for warmth to reach him. From beyond the plaid curtain came his quiet voice. "Good night, Mistress Mackinnon, and thank you. More than words can convey." "Good night, stranger," she replied, settling beneath her quilts. "May the storm spend its rage and leave you peace." Yet long after his breathing had deepened into the slow rhythm of sleep, Ilara lay awake, listening to the wind's gradual subsiding and the soft crackle of dying peats. She felt the croft altered by his presence, larger, somehow, and warmer than mere fire could account for. A subtle electricity lingered in the air, like the charge before lightning, promising that this night of unexpected mercy was only the beginning of something vast and unforeseen. And in the settle by the hearth, wrapped in her blanket, the man who had not yet given his name dreamed of a woman's steady grey eyes and the taste of barley broth offered without condition, dreamed of a warmth he had not known he craved until it was freely given. 3 dawns had passed since the storm spent its fury against the glen, leaving the world muffled beneath a thick quilt of snow. The high Cories gleamed white against a sky rinsed clean to pale winter blue, and the burns ran black between banks of ice. Ilara moved through her days as she always had, feeding the hens, breaking ice on the water trough, carrying peats from the stack, but the rhythm felt subtly altered, as though an unseen hand had shifted the cadence of her solitude. The stranger had departed at first light that morning after the gale, wrapped once more in his cloak, his face freshly shaved with the razor she had silently offered. He had stood at the door, snow creaking beneath his boots, and inclined his head with a gravity that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken volumes. "Your hospitality has preserved more than my body, Mistress Mackinnon," he had said, voice low and steady. "I shall not forget it." She had merely nodded, words feeling inadequate against the intensity in his storm-grey eyes. Then he was gone, striding up the track toward the high pass, his tall figure diminishing until the snow swallowed him entire. Yet the croft bore traces of his presence still, the faint scent of pine and wet wool lingering in the blanket she had washed and folded, the empty bowl upon the shelf that seemed to hold the memory of his hands. Ilara told herself it was folly to dwell upon a passing traveller. Men came and went along the glen roads. Kindness given was kindness returned to the giver's own heart. That should be enough. On the 4th evening, as dusk bled violet across the snowfields and the first stars pricked the sky, a knock sounded at her door. 3 measured raps, deliberate and unhurried. Ilara's heart gave an unsteady lurch. Few knocked after dark in winter, and none with such restraint. She lit the tallow candle, drew her shawl close, and opened the door a cautious handspan. He stood there again, cloaked against the biting air, snowflakes melting on the broad brim of his lowland hat. In the candle's glow his face appeared less drawn, though the shadows beneath his eyes spoke of journeys harder than mere miles. "I sought only to assure myself you suffered no ill from the storm's aftermath," he said quietly, "and to return this." He extended the folded blanket, laundered and mended with careful stitches she did not recall making. "You might have kept it," she replied, accepting it all the same. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, a fleeting contact that sent warmth racing along her arm like spilled whiskey. "The nights remain cold," he continued. "Might I impose upon your fire once more?" "Only briefly." Ilara stepped aside without hesitation. "The fire is generous, and the kettle near boiling." Thus began the pattern. He came thrice weekly, always at dusk when the village windows glowed behind drawn curtains and few eyes marked a solitary figure on the upper track. Never on Sabbath evenings, nor when the moon was full and bright enough to betray footprints. He arrived on foot, without horse or servant, his fine boots traded for coarser ones that left no distinctive mark. They spoke little at first. He would accept a bowl of whatever simmered on the hob, kale broth, mutton stew thickened with barley, once a precious rabbit snared in the policies, and sit by the hearth while she carded wool or darned. Silence wrapped them comfortably, broken only by the fire's murmur and the wind's distant song through the pines. Yet gradually words crept in, tentative as snowmelt. One night he spoke of books, Burns and Scott, but also older Gaelic bards whose verses he recited in a low, resonant voice that made the croft feel vast as a banqueting hall. Another evening he asked about her herbs, listening intently as she described the properties of bog myrtle and feverfew, her hands moving among the dried bunches as she named them. His questions were never idle. He absorbed her answers as though storing provisions for a long famine. In return he offered fragments of himself, carefully chosen yet deeply felt. "I have known halls filled with voices," he said once, staring into the flames, "yet never felt less alone than in this quiet room." Ilara's needle stilled. Loneliness is not measured by the number of souls nearby, but by whether any truly see you. His gaze turned to her sharply, as though she had struck a hidden wound. "And you," he asked softly, "do you feel seen here in this glen?" "I am known," she corrected, "known as the widow McKinnon who tends her own sheep and asks no favor." "It is not the same thing." A long pause followed, heavy with understanding. On the nights he came, the croft seemed to expand, its walls receding to accommodate something larger than daily toil. Ilara found herself anticipating dusk with a quickening she had not felt since girlhood. She baked extra oatcakes, set aside the best honey from her one hive, told herself it was mere hospitality. But she began to notice details about him that hospitality alone could not explain. The way his left hand bore a faint scar across the knuckles, the subtle authority in how he held a cup, the leather-bound journal he sometimes drew from his coat to note a thought before tucking it away again. His speech, though guarded, carried the polish of education far beyond the village schoolmaster's. Yet he wore no clan badge, claimed no surname. The village, however, possessed sharper eyes than she credited. It began with Morag Fraser, no kin to the laird despite the name, a widow who lived 3 crofts down and whose tongue was quicker than her spinning wheel. Morag noticed the extra smoke rising from Ilara's lum on certain evenings, the occasional deeper footprint near the door. She mentioned it to the baker's wife, who mentioned it to the minister's housekeeper, and soon whispers threaded through Strathmore like frost patterns on a window-pane. A man seen on the upper track after dark, heading toward the widow McKinnon's. Respectable women do not entertain strangers alone. Ilara heard none of it directly, yet felt the shift in glances at the well, the slight hesitation before greetings were returned. Highland gossip moved silently, like mist through the glen, settling cold upon the heart before one knew it had arrived. One evening, as her stranger, though he no longer felt entirely strange, sat carving a whistle from a length of elder stem, he spoke with sudden gravity. "You grant me sanctuary here, Ilara." It was the first time he had used her given name. It fell from his lips like a confession. "But I would not bring trouble upon you for it." "Trouble finds its own way," she replied, meeting his eyes steadily. "And kindness is never trouble in my reckoning." He studied her for a long moment, something fierce and tender warring in his expression. "You are a rarer soul than you know." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, erasing footprints before they could betray. Inside, the fire burned bright, and two shadowed hearts leaned imperceptibly closer across the small space between settle and stool, drawn by a current neither yet dared name, yet both felt deepening with every shared silence. The glen held its breath, waiting for what must follow. The thaw came early that year, a tentative softening of the glen as March winds carried the scent of waking earth across the snowfields. Rivulets of meltwater traced silver threads down the hillsides, and the first crocus spears pierced the dark soil behind Ilara's croft. Yet within her small domain a different season stirred, one of quiet revelations and deepening shadows. He arrived as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples, his cloak unfastened now that the bite had gone from the air. In the kinderlight she noticed anew the quality of his garments. Beneath the rough outer coat, a waistcoat of fine twill, the gleam of linen at his cuffs, the subtle embroidery of thistles along the collar, details that spoke of tailoring far beyond the village seamstress. He removed his hat with a gesture almost courtly, revealing hair neatly queued at the nape with a black ribbon. Ilara had prepared a pot of venison stew, enriched with carrots from the root cellar and wild garlic gathered on the lower slopes. She served it without comment, but her eyes lingered on the way he held the horn spoon, delicately, as though accustomed to silver. They spoke that night of dreams. "I dream often of wide halls," he said, voice low as the fire settled into ruby coals. "Halls filled with faces that look to me for wisdom I do not always possess. I wake relieved to find only darkness and silence." Ilara turned the spinning wheel steadily, the soft were filling the pauses. "And when you walk the glen in disguise, do the dreams follow?" He stilled. The question hung between them like a drawn blade. For a long moment he stared into the flames, the reflection dancing in his grey eyes. When he spoke, it was with careful deliberation. "You have guessed, then?" "Not guessed," she replied. "Observed. The way you carry yourself, even weary. The journal you guard so closely. The ring you turn inward when you think I do not notice." She nodded toward his right hand, where the signet now glinted openly, a stag rampant within a border of Celtic knotwork. He exhaled slowly, as though releasing a burden long carried alone. "I am Callum Fraser," he said at last, "Laird of Glenravy." The name settled into the room like a stone dropped into deep water. Glenravy Castle lay 10 miles distant, beyond the ridge, its towers visible on clear days as a dark silhouette against the sky. The Frasers of Glenravy were old blood, descended from the lords of the Isles, keepers of vast tracts of mountain and moor, answerable only to the crown itself in matters of clan and crown. Ilara's wheel slowed but did not stop. "And you walk your lands as a common traveller. Why?" "To see them truly," he answered. "When I ride in state, men bow and women curtsy. They speak what they believe a laird wishes to hear. Tenants hide their hunger, factors polish their accounts. But alone, on foot, cloaked in anonymity," he spread his hands, a gesture oddly vulnerable, "I glimpse the unvarnished heart of my people, their struggles, their joys, the things they would never voice to Callum Fraser, laird." She studied him across the hearth. The firelight carved hollows beneath his cheekbones, accentuated the lines of responsibility etched around his eyes. He was perhaps 35, neither young nor old, but aged by something beyond years. "And what have you seen, my laird, in the heart of Strathmore?" "That it beats strong despite hardship," he said softly. "That folk endure with grace I have not always matched in my own halls. And that one woman," his gaze lifted to hers, steady and unguarded, "one woman offers kindness without thought of advantage, and in doing so reminds a man what it feels like to be simply human." Warmth rose in Ilara's cheeks, but she did not look away. You might have revealed yourself sooner. I feared it would alter what we have here." He gestured to the small space between them, the fire, the spinning wheel, the quiet intimacy of shared evenings. This truth. Once the title is spoken, distance follows. Deference. Expectation. I have lived with those walls all my life. Here, for the first time in years, I have been free of them. The confession hung in the peat-scented air, raw and luminous. Ilara rose to bank the fire, needing movement to steady the sudden tremor in her hands. When she turned back, he was watching her with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "And now that the title is spoken?" she asked. "Now I ask your leave to continue coming," he said. "Not as laird, but as the man you have come to know. Callum. Nothing more." She considered this, heart beating swift against her ribs. To refuse would be prudent. Already whispers circled the village like crows. To accept was to step willingly into deeper waters. "I would not have you lie again," she said at length. "But neither would I lose the evenings we have shared. Come as Callum, then. The door will open." Relief softened his features, a rare unguarded smile touching his mouth. He reached into his coat and drew forth the leather journal, opening it to a fresh page. In the firelight she saw lines of elegant script interspersed with quick sketches, crofts, sheep tracks, the curve of the burn. "I have written of this glen," he said, "of its people, and of one woman whose compassion has taught me more of stewardship than any factor's ledger." He tore the page free and offered it to her. Hesitant, she took it. The words were few, but they struck her like a bell in still air. "In a humble croft at the world's edge, I found a hearth brighter than any in my castle." She asked no name, sought no favor, only offered warmth to a frozen traveler. In her grey eyes I saw reflected the man I wish to be, not the laird I am obliged to remain. Should I rule 1,000 glens, none shall hold such quiet sovereignty as this one room, lit by peat and kindness. Ilara folded the paper carefully, tucking it into her apron pocket where it rested against her heart like a secret flame. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying the faint, impossible scent of spring. Inside, the veil between them had thinned to gossamer, and something new, fragile, luminous, and perilous, bloomed in the space where stranger and widow had once sat in careful silence. Neither spoke of love. Not yet. But in the lingering glance as he took his leave, in the way her fingers brushed his as she handed him his cloak, in the soft, "Until next time, Callum," that followed him into the night, the word hovered unspoken, gathering strength like thunder beyond the hills. Spring crept forward with tentative grace, clothing the glen in pale greens and the soft gold of primroses along the burns. The sheep grew heavy with lamb, and the air carried the distant bleat of new life. Yet in Strathmore village a colder current stirred, one woven of whispers and sidelong glances that settled upon Ilara McKinnon like an unseasonal frost. It began in earnest on a Sabbath morning. Ilara walked the mile to the kirk as she always had, her best shawl of black lace over her green gown, Bible tucked beneath her arm. The path wound past crofts where smoke rose straight in the still air, and ordinarily greetings would have been called across the heather. This day, however, doors closed a fraction sooner, conversations paused as she approached, and eyes, curious, judgmental, pitying, followed her progress. Morag Fraser stood at her gate with 2 other wives, their heads bent together like conspirators. As Ilara drew near, Morag's voice carried just far enough. "Bold as brass," they say. A man seen slipping up the track thrice weekly. And her a widow not 5 years. The words struck like pebbles against glass. Ilara kept her chin high, her step unhurried, but heat rose in her throat. She had expected talk eventually. Highland villages thrived on it, but the swiftness and the venom surprised her. In the kirk she took her usual pew near the back. The minister, Mr. Galbraith, preached on the text of the woman taken in adultery, his voice rolling like winter thunder through the whitewashed walls. "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," he intoned, yet Elara felt every eye upon her when he lingered on the dangers of impropriety and the fragility of a woman's good name. After the benediction, few lingered to speak with her. Old Jean Mackenzie pressed her hand briefly. "Pay them no mind, lass," but most filed past with murmured excuses. By the time Elara walked home alone, the primroses seemed less bright, the sky heavier. The following week brought confrontation. Angus MacLeod, elder of the Kirk Session and tenant on Glenrevy land, arrived at her croft one grey afternoon. He was a stern man of 60, beard iron grey, eyes sharp as a scythe. He knocked with the handle of his crook, standing stiff upon the threshold when she opened the door. "Mistress Mackinnon," he began without preamble, "I come on behalf of the session, and as one concerned for the moral welfare of this parish." Elara stepped aside. "You are welcome to the fire, Mr. MacLeod, though I misdoubt your visit is one of mere courtesy." He entered but did not sit, remaining hat in hand like a judge. "Word has reached us, reliable word, that you have been receiving a gentleman caller in the evenings, unchaperoned. A stranger, by some accounts. This is not fitting for a woman in your position." "My position being that of a widow living alone," Elara replied evenly, folding her hands to hide their tremor. "I have offered hospitality to a traveller, nothing more." "Travellers do not return thrice weekly," MacLeod countered, "nor walk the glen after dark with such regularity. Tongues are wagging, mistress. Respectable folk speak of scandal. Invitations to quilting bees and ceilidhs have been withheld. If this continues, the session may be obliged to act." Act. The word carried weight. Public rebuke from the pulpit, exclusion from communion, social ostracism that could wither a lone woman's existence as surely as drought withered crops. "I have done nothing shameful," Elara said, voice steady though her heart pounded. "I have shared my hearth with one in need of warmth and conversation. If that is sin in Strathmore's eyes, then I stand guilty of charity." MacLeod's mouth tightened. Charity extended to men in the night invites speculation no decent woman can survive. Consider your standing, Mistress Mackinnon. Consider it carefully. He left as abruptly as he had come, the door closing with a finality that echoed through the croft. That evening Callum arrived at the usual hour, his face shadowed with concern the moment he saw hers. "You have heard, then?" he said quietly, stepping inside. "More than heard," she answered, stirring the kale pot though supper was far from ready. "I have been warned." "By Elder MacLeod himself." Callum removed his cloak slowly, eyes never leaving her. "I feared this. My presence endangers you." "Your presence endangers my reputation," she corrected, turning to face him. "A subtler thing, but in this glen no less vital. A woman alone has only her good name for shield." He crossed the room in 2 strides, stopping just short of touching her. "Then I will cease coming. I will not be the instrument of your hurt." The words struck harder than MacLeod's warning. Elara felt the croft grow colder despite the fire. "And if I ask you not to cease?" she whispered. His jaw tightened. "I would refuse, for your sake. You have given me more than I had right to expect. Sanctuary, honesty, the rare gift of being seen as a man rather than a title. I will not repay that with ruin." They stood in silence, the space between them suddenly vast. Outside, a curlew cried over the moor, a lonely, piercing sound. "Perhaps," Elara said at last, "there is a middle path." Less frequent visits. Greater caution. But even as she spoke, doubt shadowed her words. Caution might delay scandal, but it would not prevent it. Whispers had already taken root. They would grow regardless. Callum reached for her hand then, slowly, giving her time to withdraw. She did not. His fingers closed warm and firm around hers. "I came to this glen seeking truth," he said, voice rough with restraint. "I found more than I sought. I found you. Whatever comes, know that." He brought her hand briefly to his lips, an unspoken promise, then released it and stepped back. "I will not come next week," he said. "Give the tongues time to tire. But I will return, Ilara, when the storm of gossip has passed, or when I can find a way to silence it forever." He left sooner than usual that night, his departure swift against the rising wind. Ilara barred the door, banked the fire, and sat long into the darkness, the elder's warning and Callum's touch warring within her. She had survived widowhood, poverty, the harsh Highland winters. She had not imagined she might not survive the slower, colder winter of a village's disapproval. Yet beneath the fear, a fiercer flame kindled, one that whispered defiance and something perilously close to hope. The glen slipped deeper into spring, yet a chill lingered in Ilara's heart that no softening sun could dispel. Days passed in a blur of necessary toil, shearing the ewes, planting kale and potatoes in the small kale-yard, mending the drystone dike where winter frost had tumbled the stones, but each task felt hollow, performed by rote while her thoughts circled the same unyielding question. How much was she willing to sacrifice for evenings of firelit conversation and the dangerous warmth of being truly seen? Callum did not come the following week, as he had promised, nor the week after. The upper track remained empty at dusk, no solitary figure emerging from the mist that rose off the thawing burns. The croft, once enlarged by his presence, now seemed to shrink, its walls pressing closer with every silent night. Ilara told herself it was for the best. The whispers in the village had quieted to a murmur. Morag Fraser's sharp tongue found other targets. Invitations resumed, tentative at first, then warmer, as though the community had decided the threat to propriety had passed. She attended a quilting bee at Jean Mackenzie's, accepted a skein of dyed wool from the baker's wife, even joined the women at the shieling for the spring washing of plaids. Outwardly, her standing mended like a carefully darned stocking, the flaw still visible upon close inspection, but no longer gaping. Inwardly, the tear widened. She missed him with an ache that startled her in quiet moments, when the kettle sang on the hob and there was no deep voice to answer its call, when the fire settled into perfect coals and no grey eyes reflected their glow, when she woke in the small hours and felt the croft's emptiness like a physical weight upon her chest. She had not known loneliness could deepen after one had tasted its opposite. On the 10th evening since his last visit, the knock came. Soft, almost hesitant, 3 measured raps that might have been the wind playing tricks. But Ilara knew. She stood frozen by the table, candle in hand, heart battering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every prudent voice within her, the voice of widowhood survived, of hard-won independence, of Angus MacLeod's stern warning, urged her to remain still, to let silence answer. Instead, she crossed the room and drew the bolt. Callum stood upon the threshold, cloak unfastened, hair damp with evening mist. In the candle's glow his face appeared gaunt, shadows carved deeper beneath cheekbones and eyes. He looked as though sleep had eluded him as thoroughly as it had her. "Ilara," he said, her name scarcely more than breath. "May I?" She stepped back, but only far enough to block the doorway rather than invite entry. The candle trembled in her grip, sending shadows dancing across the walls. "You must not come again," she said, the words scraping her throat raw. His expression did not change, yet something shattered behind his eyes. I feared you might say this. It is not fear speaking, she replied, striving for steadiness. It is clarity. The village watches. Elder MacLeod has made the consequences plain. If we continue, my name, my home, everything I have built alone, will be lost. I cannot pay that price. Not even, her voice cracked, not even for this. He reached out as though to touch her arm, but let his hand fall when she flinched. I would shield you from every consequence if I could, but I have no right to ask you to bear them. You do not ask, she whispered. That is why it is harder. Silence stretched, heavy as wet wool. Somewhere in the distance an owl called, mournful and lone. I came to this glen in disguise, Callum said at last, voice rough, because I wish to know my people without the barrier of my title. I have learned more than I bargained for, about their endurance, their quiet courage, and about the cowardice of a laird who lets a woman suffer for his selfishness. You are no coward, Ilara countered fiercely. You sought truth. That is rare enough. Truth without action is mere indulgence. He drew a steadying breath. I will not come again unless you bid me. Your peace matters more than my own. The finality in his words struck her like a physical blow. She wanted to cry out, to beg him stay despite every risk, but the image of shuttered doors and averted faces held her tongue. "Good night, Callum Fraser," she managed. He inclined his head, grave, almost regal despite the pain in his eyes. "Good night, Ilara McKinnon, and thank you for reminding me what it feels like to be whole." He turned and walked into the mist, his figure swallowed swiftly by the gathering dark. Ilara closed the door, slid the bolt with deliberate care, and stood listening until even the sound of his footfalls on the track had vanished. Then she sank to the floor beside the hearth, candle guttering in her lax fingers, and let the tears come, silent, fierce, and utterly private. Across the ridge, in the vast stone silence of Glenravy Castle, Callum sat before a fire grander than any in the glen, yet infinitely colder. Portraits of Fraser lairds glared down from the walls. Men who had led clans into battle, negotiated with kings, shaped history with iron will. None had faced a battle such as this, the simple, devastating courage of a woman choosing survival over desire. He opened his journal to a fresh page and wrote by candlelight, the quill scratching like a wounded thing. "Tonight I lost the only truth worth possessing." She closed her door not from lack of feeling, but from abundance of strength. I, who command hundreds, could not command circumstance to spare her pain. If stewardship means protecting those who have shown me mercy, then I have failed utterly. Tomorrow I must find a way to make amends, or live forever in the shadow of my own inadequacy. He sanded the page, closed the book, and stared into the flames until dawn grayed the windows. In the croft, Ilara banked the fire to embers and climbed into her box bed. The blanket smelled faintly of peat and dried herbs, no trace of pine or warm wool, no echo of a deep voice saying her name. Sleep came only in snatches, threaded with dreams of storm-lit eyes and a hand reaching across a hearth that burned brighter than any castle blaze. Both slept alone that night, separated by miles of moor and an unbridgeable gulf of duty and fear. Yet in their separate darkness, the same thought circled like a moth around a forbidden flame. This cannot be the end. In the great hall of Glenravy Castle, dawn light filtered through tall mullioned windows, striking cold fire from the polished suits of armor that lined the walls. Callum Fraser stood alone before the massive hearth, where a fire roared in defiance of the lingering Highland chill. He had not slept. The journal lay open on the oak table behind him, its last entry still damp with ink, a vow scrawled in the small hours when resolve had finally hardened into action. He had spent the night pacing these ancient flagstones, haunted by the memory of Ilara's face in the candlelight. pale, composed, yet ravaged by the choice she had been forced to make. Every instinct bred into him as laird, protection of his people, stewardship of the land, preservation of order, had twisted into self-reproach. He, who could command rents reduced in lean years or summon factors to account for a single misplaced sheep, had stood powerless while one woman bore the cost of his deception. No longer. At first light he summoned his steward, Gillespie, a spare man of 50 whose loyalty had weathered 3 generations of Frasers. "Prepare the carriage," Callum ordered without preamble. "The black one, with full harness. And send word to Elder MacLeod that I require his presence at the castle this afternoon, on a matter of urgency concerning the parish of Strathmore." Gillespie's brow arched, but he bowed. "At once, my laird." By mid-morning the castle stirred with unaccustomed purpose. Servants polished silver that had not seen use in years. The housekeeper aired the blue drawing-room with its view over the policies. Footmen in Fraser livery brushed dust from the ancestral portraits as though preparing for a coronation. Callum dressed with deliberate care. The formal coat of deep green velvet, laced with silver thread at cuffs and collar. The kilt in the Fraser hunting tartan, pinned with the Cairngorm brooch that had belonged to his father. The dirk at his belt more ornament than weapon, yet a reminder of older, fiercer days. He looked every inch the laird, remote, authoritative, untouchable. The man who had walked the glen in rough wool seemed a ghost now, but the ghost had served its purpose. It had led him to truth. At noon the carriage rolled into the courtyard, its lacquered panels gleaming, the Fraser stag rampant picked out in gold upon the doors. Callum descended the stone steps, his factor falling in behind like a shadow. "One more instruction," he told Gillespie quietly. "We make a stop before returning. At the croft of Mistress Ilara McKinnon, on the upper Strathmore track. She is to be conveyed here with all courtesy. Inform her the matter is of gravest importance and admits no delay." Gillespie hesitated only a fraction. "Shall I send an escort, my laird?" "No. The carriage and myself will suffice." The horses' hoofs struck sparks from the cobbles as the carriage swept through the gates and down the long avenue of ancient oaks. Callum sat back against the crimson leather, hands clasped to still their tremor. He had faced Jacobite skirmishes in his youth, negotiated with Edinburgh lawyers over land rights, buried parents and a younger brother, but nothing had unsettled him like the prospect of facing Ilara again, this time in the full weight of his station. The road wound upward through the pass, the castle falling away behind like a dark crown upon the hill. As they descended into Strathmore, villagers paused in their tasks to stare. Children at the burn, women at the well, old men mending nets. The laird's carriage had not been seen in the village proper for years. Speculation would already be rife. At Ilara's croft the carriage drew to a halt amid a flurry of dust and startled hens. Callum stepped down unaided, ignoring the footman's proffered hand. The door of the croft stood open to the mild spring air. Ilara was visible within, bent over the table kneading oat dough, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair escaping its knot in damp curls about her face. She straightened at the sound of wheels, wiping flour from her hands, and froze when she saw the crest upon the door. Her eyes, those clear grey eyes that had haunted his nights, widened as Callum approached. He removed his hat, holding it against his chest like a supplicant rather than a laird. "Mistress McKinnon," he said formally, though his voice betrayed him with a slight unsteadiness, "I must speak with you on a matter that cannot wait. Will you do me the honour of accompanying me to Glenravy Castle?" Ilara's hands clutched the apron at her waist. Flour dusted the flagstones where she had taken an involuntary step back. "My laird," she said, the title falling strangely from lips that had once spoken his given name with ease. I am not dressed for—" "You are dressed as the woman who saved me from more than a storm," he interrupted gently. "That is enough." She glanced at the carriage, grand, imposing, utterly foreign to her world, then back to his face. Something in his expression, earnest beneath the formal gravity, decided her. She untied the apron, smoothed her hair with trembling fingers, fetched her shawl from the peg. As the carriage rolled away, Ilara sat opposite him, hands folded tightly in her lap, gazing out at the passing heather with determined composure. Callum watched her profile, the delicate line of jaw, the resolute set of mouth, and felt the full weight of what he must now undo. The castle rose before them like something from a bard's tale, towers and turrets against the pale sky, banners snapping in the wind. Footmen sprang to open the doors. Gillespie awaited on the steps. Ilara descended with quiet dignity, though Callum saw the slight tremor in her hand as she accepted his arm. He led her not to the vast formal hall, but to the smallest study overlooking the gardens, a room lined with books and maps, warmed by a fire despite the mild day. Sunlight slanted through the windows, gilding the dust motes in the air. "Will you sit?" he asked, indicating the chair opposite his desk. She did, spine straight, hands still folded. "You spoke of urgency, my laird." "Callum," he corrected softly. "Here, in this room, I would be Callum again, if you permit it." A flicker crossed her face. Pain, perhaps, or memory. "What is it you require of me?" "Not require," he said. "Request. And first, an apology." He moved to stand before her, close enough to see the pulse beating at her throat. "I allowed you to suffer for my silence. I hid behind anonymity while you paid the price in whispers and warnings. That ends today." He turned as a knock sounded. Gillespie ushered in Angus MacLeod, who entered with the wary stiffness of a man summoned before his superior. His eyes widened at the sight of Ilara, then narrowed in confusion. "My laird," MacLeod began, bowing. "You sent for me." "I did," Callum said, voice ringing with quiet authority. "On a matter concerning the moral welfare of Strathmore parish. Be seated, elder." MacLeod obeyed, perching uneasily on the edge of a chair. Ilara remained silent, colour rising in her cheeks. Callum did not sit. He stood with hands clasped behind his back, every inch the laird now. "Word has reached me," he began, "that the good name of Mistress Ilara Mackinnon has been called into question, that she has been accused of impropriety for offering hospitality to a traveller in need. I am here to set the record straight." MacLeod shifted. "My laird, the session acted only too—" "The session acted in haste," Callum cut in, steel beneath the calm. "The traveller in question was myself. I walked my lands in plain clothing to see them without the veil of my title. Mistress Mackinnon offered me shelter from a storm, broth from her pot, and conversation by her hearth, nothing more. For this act of simple Christian charity she has endured censure. That censure ends now." MacLeod's face drained of colour. "Furthermore," Callum continued, "I declare before you, as elder and representative of the parish, that Mistress Mackinnon's character is beyond reproach. She is a woman of rare compassion and integrity. Any further whisper against her will be considered a slight against Glenrevie itself, and answered accordingly." The words fell into the room like stones into deep water. MacLeod swallowed, eyes darting between laird and widow. "I understand, my laird," he managed at last. "The session will be informed." "See that it is," Callum said. "You may go." MacLeod rose, bowed awkwardly, and retreated with unbecoming haste. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Only then did Callum turn fully to Ilara. The laird's mask slipped. In its place was the man who had once sat by her peat fire, vulnerable and wondering. "That settles the village," he said quietly. "But it does not settle what lies between us." Ilara rose slowly, as though fearing the ground might shift beneath her. "You have restored my name," she said, voice hushed. "More than restored. I am grateful beyond words. Gratitude is not what I seek." He stepped closer, stopping just short of touching her. "I seek you, Ilara. All of you. Not as a secret visitor in the night, but openly. As my wife, if you will have me." The words hung in the sunlit air, impossible and radiant. Her eyes filled, but she did not look away. "You offer me a world I do not know," she whispered. "A world that may never fully accept me." "Then I will teach you the world," he answered fiercely, "and teach the world you. For I have learned, through you, that a life without truth, without you, is no life at all." Outside, the gardens burst with the first brave blooms of spring. Inside, two souls long isolated stood on the precipice of a future neither had dared imagine. One forged in a humble croft by a simple bowl of broth, now ready to blaze brighter than any castle hearth. The study at Glenrevy Castle held its breath in the hush that followed Callum's words. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, gilding the edges of ancient books and the polished mahogany desk, yet the air between the two figures felt charged, as though the very atoms of the room had paused to witness what might come next. Ilara stood motionless, her grey eyes wide with astonishment, tears trembling upon her lashes like dew upon heather. The simple green wool of her gown, still dusted faintly with flour from her interrupted baking, seemed a quiet defiance amid the opulence surrounding her. She had entered this room as a summoned tenant, now she was offered its mastery. Callum remained close, his formal velvet coat and tartan suddenly feeling like armor too heavy to bear. Every line of his body spoke supplication rather than command. The slight forward tilt, the hands open at his sides, the unguarded vulnerability in his storm-grey eyes. "Ilara," he said again, softer now, as though her name were a prayer he had no right to utter. "I know what I ask. I know the gulf between your croft and these halls is wider than any Highland glen. But I have learned, in the quiet of your hearth, that true nobility is not measured in stone or silver, but in the courage to offer warmth without condition. You taught me that. Let me spend the rest of my days proving I have learned the lesson well." A single tear escaped, tracing a slow path down her cheek. "You speak of courage," she whispered, "yet it is you who risk scandal, marrying beneath your station, inviting the scorn of every drawing-room from here to Edinburgh." "Let them scorn," he answered fiercely. "I have borne their deference all my life and found it colder than any winter gale. I would rather face their disdain with you at my side than their approval alone." He sank slowly to one knee, laird of ancient blood kneeling upon his own carpet before a widow in homespun wool. From his pocket he drew a ring, not the ostentatious jewel of a noble house, but an older piece, white gold shaped like intertwined heather stems, set with a single sapphire the color of deep loch water. "This belonged to my mother," he said. "She, too, was accused of marrying beneath her when she chose my father for love rather than advantage. She wore it until her death and told me to give it only to a woman who saw the man, not the title. I have waited 35 years to obey her." Ilara's breath caught. The room seemed to tilt, the walls receding until there was only the man before her and the impossible future he offered. "I cannot promise you ease," he continued, voice steady despite the tremor in his outstretched hand. "There will be those who whisper, who question, who wait for you to falter. But I can promise you this, my protection, my devotion, and every resource of this house to shield you from harm. More than that, I promise you my heart, whole and unhidden, for as long as I draw breath. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because from this moment on, nothing in this story remains the same. The words hung in the sunlit air like a vow already half sworn. Elara looked down at him, at the proud head bowed, the strong hand extended, and felt the last careful walls she had built around her heart crumble like dry stone in spring rain. She reached out slowly, her work-roughened fingers closing over his. The sapphire flashed as he slid the ring onto her hand. It fit as though it had waited generations for this exact moment. "Yes," she said, the single word ringing clear and unafraid. "Yes, Callum Fraser. I will marry you. Not for castle or title or the silencing of whispers, but because in your company I have felt, for the first time since Ian's death, that I am truly home." He rose in one fluid motion and drew her into his arms. The kiss that followed began gentle, almost reverent, as though both feared the other might vanish like mist at dawn. Then it deepened, years of loneliness and longing pouring into the contact until the world narrowed to the warmth of mouths and the thunder of shared heartbeats. When at last they parted, foreheads resting together, Callum's voice was rough with wonder. "You have made me the richest man in Scotland, Elara Mackinnon soon-to-be Fraser." "And you," she answered, smiling through tears, "have given me back the sun." A discreet knock sounded at the door. Gillespie entered, eyes carefully averted from the couple still clasped together. "The household is assembled in the great hall as you requested, my laird. And word has already reached the village. Riders saw the carriage return with Mistress Mackinnon. Tongues will be busy tonight." Callum's arm tightened protectively around Elara's waist. "Then let us give them something true to speak of." He led her through the corridors, past footmen who bowed with sudden wonder, past maids who curtsied with shy smiles, until they reached the great hall. Word had indeed spread. Servants lined the walls in quiet anticipation, and through the open doors Elara glimpsed tenants and villagers gathering in the courtyard beyond, summoned by swift messengers. Callum raised his voice, clear and commanding, yet warm with joy. "Good people of Glenrevie," he declared, "I present to you Mistress Elara Mackinnon, who will shortly become your lady. She came to this house today not as petitioner, but as the woman who has claimed my heart and restored my faith in the goodness of this land. Let no voice be raised against her, for any slight upon her name is a slight upon mine own." A murmur rippled through the hall, surprise giving way to tentative cheers. Old Jean Mackenzie, who had walked from the village to see the truth for herself, dabbed at her eyes with her apron. Even Angus MacLeod, standing stiffly at the back, managed a grudging nod. Elara felt the weight of every gaze, yet Callum's hand steady at her back anchored her. She lifted her chin and met the assembly with the same quiet courage that had once opened her croft door to a storm-tossed stranger. Later, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the castle blazed with unexpected celebration, pipes skirling in the courtyard, tables laden with venison and whiskey, Callum drew Elara aside to the small library where they could hear the music faintly through the walls. "I would have spared you this tumult," he said, brushing a curl from her forehead. "A quiet wedding, perhaps, with only the minister and Jean to witness." She laughed softly, the first true laugh he had heard from her in weeks. "I have lived quietly long enough. Let the glen rejoice if it will. We have earned it." He kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the miracle of permission granted at last. Outside, the spring stars wheeled over Glenrevie, brighter than any chandelier. Inside, two souls who had once offered and accepted simple kindness by a humble peat fire now stood on the threshold of a future vast as the Highlands themselves, forged not in grandeur, but in the quiet, enduring flame of truth recognized and chosen. The reckoning was complete. The vow was sealed. And nothing, from this moment on, would ever be the same. The wedding took place on a radiant midsummer morning, when the glen burst forth in a riot of purple heather and the air hummed with the scent of wild thyme and beeswax. Glenrevie Castle's chapel, long silent save for Sunday services, overflowed with folk from near and far, tenants in their best tartans, villagers in starched collars and bonnets, even a few distant kin from Edinburgh who had arrived with raised eyebrows but departed with softened smiles. The minister's voice echoed off the stone vaults as Callum and Ilara exchanged vows, not the formal recitations of duty, but words woven from their shared nights by the croft fire, promises of warmth in cold seasons, truth amid deception, and companionship that bridged every chasm of birth or fate. Ilara wore a gown of soft ivory silk, embroidered with thistles and heather blooms by the castle seamstresses, her chestnut hair crowned with a circlet of fresh wildflowers. No veil obscured her face. She met Callum's gaze openly, steadily, as she had that first storm-lit night. He stood tall in the full regalia of his clan, kilt and jacket in Fraser green, the sapphire brooch at his throat matching the ring upon her finger. When he slid the matching band onto her hand, the assembly held its breath. When he kissed her at the altar's end, a cheer rose that shook the rafters. The feast that followed spilled from the great hall into the gardens, tables groaning under roasted venison, fresh bannocks, and casks of heather ale. Pipers skirled tunes both merry and mournful, and for the first time in memory, laird and tenants danced together under the open sky, Ilara laughing as Callum whirled her in a reel, her skirts flying like petals in the wind. Old feuds softened in the warmth of shared joy. Even Angus MacLeod raised a glass in toast, his stern face cracking into a reluctant grin. As evening fell and lanterns flickered to life among the trees, Callum drew Ilara away to the battlements overlooking the glen. The heather rolled away in waves of twilight purple, the distant crofts twinkling like fallen stars. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly, echoing a question he had posed in shadows long ago. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "Regret the man who walked into my storm and stayed? Never. Though I confess, these halls still feel vast after my croft." He chuckled, arm tightening around her waist. "Then we shall make them smaller, with laughter, with life, with whatever it takes to make them home." In the months that followed, Glenrevie transformed under their shared stewardship. Ilara brought the simplicity of her croft life to the castle's grandeur. Herbs from her garden now scented the kitchens alongside exotic spices from distant ports. Recipes learned at her mother's knee mingled with the chef's elaborate confections, creating meals that nourished body and soul alike. She walked the tenancies with Callum, not as distant lady but as one who had known lean winters, offering advice on lambing, sharing remedies for blight, listening to grievances with the same quiet attention she had once given a weary traveller. The servants noticed the change first. The laird's study, once a fortress of ledgers and solitude, now rang with Ilara's voice reading aloud from Burns or Scott. The formal dinners gave way to informal gatherings where footmen sat with factors, sharing stories by the fire. Whispers of the Croft lass evolved into respectful murmurs of Our Lady, as her compassion bridged the old divides between high and low. Callum, too, bloomed in ways he had not anticipated. Freed from the mask of isolated authority, he confided doubts to his wife in the quiet hours before dawn, fears of failing his people, memories of battles lost. In her arms he rediscovered vulnerability as strength, not weakness. In her counsel he found wisdom sharper than any adviser's. The journal that had once held secret musings now filled with shared reflections, sketches of the glen in summer bloom, verses composed together by candlelight, records of a life remade. One autumn evening, as golden leaves swirled across the moor, they sat before the great hall's hearth, a fire vast as a bonfire yet no warmer than the peat blaze of old. Callum opened the journal to an early page, his voice steady as he read. "In the Gael's heart I found sanctuary not in stone, but in a woman's unyielding kindness. She saw the man beneath the mantle, and in that seeing, called forth the laird I might become. Now, bound in vow and heart, we stand together, proof that the simplest mercy can topple empires of isolation." Ilara's eyes misted. "When did you add that?" last night, while you slept." He closed the book, drawing her close. "You have remade me, Elara, not with title or wealth, but with the quiet miracle of being known." "And you have given me roots deeper than any croft," she replied, fingers tracing the lines of his face. "A place where I am not merely endured, but cherished." Outside, the wind sang through the pines, a gentler song now, carrying the promise of enduring seasons. Inside, the fire burned steady, illuminating two souls who had journeyed from stranger to beloved, from solitude to unbreakable bond. In time, the glen came to tell their tale around winter hearths. How a widow's open door had thawed a laird's frozen heart, how kindness offered without expectation had bridged worlds thought impassable. It became a legend of the Highlands, not of battles won or fortunes amassed, but of the profound truth that the greatest nobility lies in seeing another's humanity and responding with grace. For in every act of compassion, no matter how small, lies the seed of transformation. A bowl of broth by a fire, a hand extended in storm, such gestures echo through lives, reshaping destinies in ways grander than any castle's tower. Elara and Callum lived that truth, their union a beacon for all who wandered lonely paths. That love, born of unpretentious mercy, blooms eternal as the heather upon the moor.